Oh, I can't see you. This is going to be an unusual presentation.
Who's
You need to turn the mic on. Hello? Oh, it's working now? Okay. Okay. No, this is not about airplane stories as much as it is about some things that I really felt that I wanted to share with you. And I want to point out that Dick gave a Voyager talk over at the museum a couple days ago, and I joined him for the last of that, and we had some just wonderful discussions on Q&A afterwards. And we're going to be able to do that tonight. They've told us that the last bus out is 11 o'clock, so we've got we should have a lot of fun chatting. I wish I could turn those lights down. I'd like to see the audience, so I usually, if you could turn that down, it'd be great. Because I usually tell you based on the whites of your eyes and also whether you're still there. Okay. Saturday was a big deal for me because Apollo was a big deal for me. The 50th anniversary, the most historic milestone of my life. Here's a picture of the crew at the when they were young, when they flew, and also a picture taken recently. And the journalist comes up to Buzz Aldrin and he's saying, I can remember exactly where I was 50 years ago. And Buzz Aldrin looked at him and he says, me too. How many of you actually watched one of the big specials? You know, like things that are on CNN and what on the 50th anniversary? I watched something that probably very few of you watched. How many of you watched the 5-hour, 4-part series by Bill Whittle on Apollo 11? Okay. That was a pretty small bit of the crowd, and I believe that his insight and the things that he saw in that were so profound and so wonderful that I decided to use part of my talk to share some of that with you, because I think very few of you got a chance to look at that 4-part series. NASA has hundreds of different flight patches. If you fly a shuttle flight number 46 or something, there's a patch, and your names are on it. The patch for Apollo 11 is unique. Out of hundreds of patches, it's the only one. It has an eagle about to touch down on the lunar surface. The olive branch of peace is in its talons. It's the only mission logo ever to not list the names of the crew. By the way, I want to make sure you understand that what you'll see in these next slides, and I read it, these are not my words. I'm reading what Bill Whittle said in his special. Not to list the names of the crews, that was something Neil personally demanded. To his dying day, he maintained that everything they had done as a team and as a nation. If they were old enough to see it live, everyone remembers that blurry white shape as Armstrong stepped onto the moon. It wasn't just the emotional climax of Apollo 11, it was a climax of everything the entire country had been obsessed with since October 4th of 1957, when America woke up to discover there was a Soviet satellite overhead and the Soviets had hydrogen bombs. Again, these are Bill Whittle's words. I got to watch the moon landing in the Plaza Hotel in New York City. The windows were open so we could hear the massive crowd of people gathered around the giant projection screens in Central Park. Watching live, there were about 600 million people, it is estimated, that actually watched the moon landing watched Neil step out onto the moon on television. One in five of people, the total people on the earth actually watch television. They remember one small step. We weren't biting our nails as Neil came down the ladder. That was 6 hours earlier during the landing. There was no live video of the landing. We stared at a countdown clock, big blocky 1960s digits. During the descent, all we got to watch was an animation of the lunar module. Remember, the things that we see after that were film that came back from the mission, and you can see them approaching the moon, kicking up the dust and water. We didn't see any of that live. They had to take 16 millimeter film and develop it after the flight to be able to show that to us. We did have live mission control audio of the landing. The animated lunar module got lower and lower, then the clock goes to zero, then we see a lunar module on a plaster moon with big rocks in the foreground, so we know it's down. Houston, 60 seconds. 60 seconds till what? Despite the animation, the actual lunar module was not on the moon yet. For a little over 30 seconds, there were only 2 people who knew exactly why the moon landing had not happened yet. And they didn't have time to let us or even mission control in on it, because Armstrong and Aldrin had less than 30 seconds in which to save the mission and their lives. Sorry. Descending down to 60 feet, 6 stories high now 4 stories high, no one mentions it, but they have entered the dead man's curve. In 40 seconds, they will either be on the moon or in it. They are too low now to do a successful abort back to orbit. They're going to land safely or they're going to die. One of the 4-foot-long probes has made contact with another world. Armstrong eases it in for another 2 or 3 seconds, then shuts down the engine. The Apollo 11 mission profile called for a landing with 2 minutes of fuel remaining. The abort operation would have required about 20 seconds of fuel. When Armstrong kills the engine, there are 19 seconds of fuel remaining. Aldrin, ACA out of detent. Armstrong, out of detent. Aldrin, mode control, both auto. Descent engine command override, off. Engine arm off, 413 is in. That's the first thing said on the moon. The first confirmation that we, the public, had that the man had landed on the moon didn't come from the moon. It came from Houston, Texas. Houston, we copy you down, Eagle. Then Armstrong says, Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed. And then in utter silence, Neil Armstrong, age 38, Buzz Aldrin Jr., age 39, turned to each other, smiled, and shook hands. They were too far away, far too away to hear that avalanche of sound, that roar that shook the windows down at Central Park. Tens of thousands of Americans who had been sitting there breathless on the grass in Central Park rose to their feet and let go with a kind of cheering I had not heard before. Anybody remember seeing this picture? Do you remember what you thought when you saw this picture? My friend, Bill Whittle saw a lot more than I saw in it. And he saw a lot more than I think anyone else saw in it. And I want to read you, if I can, what his thoughts were about this picture. It's a picture of Armstrong in the lunar module after the moonwalk, or excuse me, after the walking on the moon. They had repressurized the Eagle and removed their helmets. He looks very tired. He needs a shave, and no doubt a shower as well. His eyes appear swollen and red. But the look on his face is just transcendental. Eyes and smile are not those of a 38-year-old steely-eyed missile man. Neil Armstrong looks exactly like a 6-year-old kid seeing a shiny new bike in front of the Christmas tree on Christmas morning. The blue eyes appear to be a little watery. A first time at Disneyland look. You're just so happy you're about to cry. That photo is one of the most remarkable pictures ever taken of anyone. There's joy and deep pride you must feel after realizing that you have just done the single most difficult task in the history of the world. There's an overwhelming sense of relief, strong enough to come forward half a century and still knock the wind out of you. 600 million people who could get to a television had watched this man carry the weight of everyone, the dreams and sweat of the 375,000 people who worked on Project Apollo. Neil looks like a man who has the satisfaction of having carried the weight for all of that time and finished the job without screwing the pooch. I was kind of confused about what to share with you guys on this talk, and watching that, I just flat had to share that with you. Yeah. There's more. Apollo's test schedule was extremely complex, with each test flight depending on the last in order to move on. We're talking a little over 8.5 years to go from a little suborbital flight with a Mercury Redstone all the way to landing on the moon. Now, at long last, it was time for someone to ride a Saturn V. But there was a problem. The lunar module wasn't ready yet. The time was running out. It takes too long in fine print here. Whittle discusses all of the various changes that had to be made to the schedule. So they improvised. They would delay a manned test of both the lunar module and the command service module in Earth orbit. They delayed that, and they threw an entire mission and schedule out the window. They didn't do it. They had a moon rocket. They had a moon capsule. They had a moon crew. So they could go to the moon without a lunar module. It was the boldest, most brilliant decision made during the entire Apollo program. Apollo would go to the moon in December of 1968. When they came home, if they came home, there would be exactly 1 calendar year left to fulfill the promise of JFK, with still 2 missions needed before the first landing could be attempted. When I heard the cheering in Central Park on July 20th, 1969, when Apollo landed on the moon, I said I would not hear a sound like that again. Last year, I was watching the first flight of Falcon Heavy. Outside the SpaceX control room, a huge crowd of people, almost all in their 20s and 30s, had gathered to watch the launch live. The sound they made when it cleared the pad was tremendous. The roar they made at first stage separation was heartwarming. But when those two booster rockets simultaneously dropped into frame to land on pillars of fire, the sound that came out of that room full of millennials was exactly the same sound I heard in 1969 coming out of Central Park. It's a different vibe this time, less tense, a lot more fun. You launch a candy apple red convertible complete with space-suited mannequin, David Bowie on the radio. You're not just doing something that the Chinese, the Russians, the European, and NASA could not do. You're having a blast. When the SpaceX twin boosters landed, a 20-something friend of mine texted me and said, "This was our moon landing." I disagree. Landing in Mars will be your moon landing. The young engineers and technicians at SpaceX might be the ones doing it. And we Apollo kids, contrary to what we thought 5 years ago, are gonna live to see it. Our great-grandfathers went to the moon using slide rules, genius, and guts. We've been waiting for 50 years for someone to go further than we did. We Apollo kids dare you to do it. We double dare you. These were just some tidbits out of 5 hours of video that you can see on YouTube. And if you're an Apollo geek, it's really something cool to watch. Okay, now we're going to talk about me. These are my words. With Apollo moon landing in the news, I'm compelled to share some observations. First, the question of courage to take risks. The decision to use lunar orbit rendezvous, the method that was used instead of going to the moon directly and coming back. That decision, which required rendezvous around the moon, that decision was made 3.4 years before anybody had made a rendezvous around the Earth. Can you imagine somebody making a decision like that and getting Grumman building the lunar module and 3.4 years before we found that you could rendezvous around the Earth, that was our plan. We don't think like that anymore, do we? The very first time humans flew on the huge Saturn V, they flew to orbit the moon 2,000 times higher than humans had ever flown. And that was the first ride on a Saturn V. In spite of the crazy risks, America's 1960s space systems were statistically the safest transportation system there were. There were no fatalities or injuries while attempting to fly out of the atmosphere with any of the 7 different rocket systems flown by Americans. The next 8 slides are what I use in many of my space talks that I give. And it's to compare the early manned space programs in the 60s to what followed. They end with my answer to, can NASA now take us to the moon or Mars? And I think they answer that question. In the 60s, 9 manned space launch systems were built and flown. 7 of those were United States of America. Vostok, Gagarin, Alan Shepard on a Redstone. Anybody have seen a Redstone? It's about that big around. Yeah, it's set on a milk stool. John Glenn's in the Atlas. General Joe Engle, who I just hugged back here, he flew the X-15. Unfortunately, he didn't go to space, and only Joe Walker went above 100 kilometers. But because it went above 100 kilometers, it was the fourth manned space rocket system to put people out of the atmosphere. And then, of course, there's Titan. And then there's Soyuz. Well, Soyuz, does that sound familiar? That's a Russian rocket. It was flown in '67. And is the only ride to orbit right now. Let me say that again. It was flown in 1967. And it's the only ride to orbit now. You had a '67 car, and it's the only car you can drive now. The Saturn 1B flew one or two manned space flights in the '60s. Actually, it also flew people to the Skylab space station in the '70s. But this whole slide's about '60s. And of course, Saturn V. And of course, I believe that the picture of the thing in the lower right defines the definition of a manned rocket launch system that put humans in space during the '60s. And it's the upper stage of the LEM. Well, let's talk about the next 49 years. I just got through having a slide for what amounted to really 9 years. Let's look at the next 49 years, and let's look at the new rocket launch systems that put humans out of the atmosphere. Of course, the space shuttle, the Chinese Shenzhou, and a home built by a few dozen people in Mojave. Isn't it weird that the world did 9 in the '60s and only 3 in the last 49 years? I'm not proud of that. I'm embarrassed by it. How many of you here in the audience were born before 1935? Come on. Wait a minute. Born before 1935? Okay, I want somebody out there to lie to me and stand up and say, I was born before 1935. Here, you do it. Ma'am? Real loud. You were born before 1935.
My dad was.
You were born before 1935. You're very special because no one born after 1935 has walked on the moon. What? According to this chart, which was prepared 10 or 15 years ago, we're right on the schedule. There's only 4 people alive now that have walked on the moon. Just 4. And it won't be very long when the Earth will have walked on the moon. And doesn't that really piss you off? I'm going to talk about some segments of time that are decades. And the decades start in 1961 when Yuri Gagarin was launched to orbit by the Russians. So we're talking about 61 until 1971. Okay, Alan Shepard. So rode a little red stone that wasn't as big around as Spaceship One, by the way. Suborbital space flight. In less than 10 years, Alan Shepard took a 6-iron and hit golf balls on the moon. What the hell have we done in 10 years? To me, that seems impossible now, and yet we lived through it. 10 years. Let's look at the next 10 years. 71 to 81. First flight of the space shuttle was 1981. You see somebody floating in a space station so large you can get lost in the middle? And if you run around the periphery with centrifugal force, you can run. You've probably seen that video in Skylab.
Yeah.
We don't have anything like that now. The International Space Station is an ugly, square, junky science lab with wires going all over the place. It is. How many people have been there? Oh, really? There's a bunch of people who have been there. That 10-year time period, 71 to 81, the world launched planetary missions to explore our solar system at the rate of 4.6 per year over that 10 years. Now, a lot of these missions failed and didn't get to their destinations, but the world tried to explore our solar system 4.6 times a year for 10 years. Well, I'm not going to show you the next decade because there wasn't much going on. I'm going to show you the next more than 3 decades. We're talking about, what is this, 34 years or something? 38. Okay. Almost 4 decades, right? Okay, the space shuttle, the International Space Station, and Soyuz, they go only where Gagarin and Glenn went 57 years ago. It's the only place they go. What? We had a big Saturn V, and the first time we flew it, we went to the moon. And in more than 3 decades, nobody went farther than Yuri Gagarin and John Glenn. Who was thinking up there and planning a space exploration? Who was it? Are they in jail?
They should be.
The first year after 1961, after Yuri Gagarin's flight, that next year, there were 5 manned space flights. In 2004, how many manned space flights were there?
5.
There were 5. And a bunch of home builders in Mojave had to do 3 of them. And we went downhill big time in planetary courageousness to explore the planet. I'm not saying we went downhill in technology. We certainly had better technology. But in this whole big time period, multi-decades, there were only 2 attempts per year to explore the solar system with robots. God, we should do it thousands now. I'm holding in my hand in this picture a little piece of Spaceship One. And at the request of Alan Stern, the principal investigator at New Horizons, which launched a non-JPL developed deep space probe, he wanted a non-NASA developed manned spaceship, a little piece of that. He wanted it to go to Pluto. Isn't that cool? It took 9 years to get there. And then 1 billion miles further, it went by Pluto in 2015, 1 billion miles further, on New Year's Day this year, it went by Ultima Thule, which is a Kuiper Belt object. And that's really cool to think that a piece of Spaceship One is still out there flying through the Kuiper Belt. Okay, now for the big question that I promised you. I'm going to explain right here why why NASA could not do Apollo today.
Money.
It has nothing to do with money.
Will.
No.
Courage.
You give them all the money you want to.
Deep state.
Wouldn't happen.
Deep state.
How many here have read the book Angle of Attack by Harrison Storms? The book about, a few of you. Okay, there's two books you really ought to read if you're interested in this. One is Chariots for Apollo, which is written about the development of the lunar lander, and the other one was Angle of Attack, written about Harrison Storms, who was the developer of the Apollo capsule. I'm going to read the first paragraph out of one of the chapters. It says, years later, almost everybody involved would say they should have taken a few months off right in the beginning to sit down and decide what exactly it was they were going to build. But the people who say that have forgotten the desperate mood of the country in the opening months of 1962. If NASA and North American had taken a calm, scientific approach to the moon race, Congress and the American people would have eaten them alive. What? If they did this normal, proper, calm, scientific approach, the American people and the Congress would have eaten them alive? Did that statement come from a different solar system? That statement right there, to me, makes clear why we can't do this now. There is no way we can think like that. At least by government, to go back to the moon. All right, shifting gears. It said you do not get to choose your parents. Right, Dick? We didn't choose our parents. But we were very lucky. Our father, known as Pop, taught us honesty, respect. He taught us even how to have fun, and he never said to Dick or I, oh, you can't do that. Not ever. Pop told me before he died that when he was 12, it's the same year that Lindbergh flew to Paris, that his mom took him out to a local airport, and he saw a speck in the sky getting larger, and it was a Ford Tri-Motor. And he was just absolutely blown away by how huge it was and how impressive it was. And I found a picture on the internet with some 12-year-olds looking over a fence in that era. One of those could be my dad. My dad concluded right then, I believe I would never in my lifetime get to ride in an airplane. Okay, a couple of slides on what I call two flights. If you're not part of the aviation community, I am known, and Dick is known, pretty much for just two flights. Right? One of them took 9 days, the Voyager flight. And I'm taking too much of this time, so I'll let Dick talk to you about Voyager. And by the way, if you miss any of his presentations at the museum on Voyager, they were phenomenal. I hadn't heard it in a long time, and I got to do that yesterday.
Thank you.
Yeah. The other flight that the public knows me for is the Spaceship One flight on the 21st of June 2004. And somebody who does media research told me at the time that if you use the criteria of how many world newspapers cover a story above the fold, you know what that means, above the fold? You see a stack of newspapers and you see it on it. How many world newspapers covered above the fold? Our flight with Spaceship One, our little home built out of Mojave, was the #2 story, world story of 2004. And if they hadn't dragged Saddam Hussein out of his spider hole, it would have been #1. I'm going to shift gears again and show you some things that I have not shown in my speaks at Oshkosh, or really anywhere. And I want to share with you some things that I thought would be kind of cool to show you. Sally Melville is not here this week, but her husband Mike Melville is here. He was at my talk at noon today. The picture on the left I labeled fear. The word from Spaceship One is that the trim control is stuck in a position so Spaceship One cannot survive re-entry and certainly can't be landed, and her husband's up there falling into the atmosphere. A few minutes later is joy, and that's when she sees her husband controlling Spaceship One flying overhead, getting ready to circle and land in front of us. I'm going to talk about RAF, a little different than how I normally talk about it. Got a single slide here. I'm going to talk about, Scaled Composites, the bigger company that I founded in Mojave. And trying to decide what would be best to talk to this audience, I decided to show you some things that kind of were in my heart. And the thing that boiled right to the top, because he gave me and my wife Tanya, who's a seaplane pilot, John Carco gave us rides in the Icon when I was here 4 years ago, out here in the lake. And to me is a hero. The Global Flyer airplane that was built for Steve Fawcett to try to attempt to beat Dick's records. He beat a couple of them only by flying 3 flights, non-refueled, around the world. Remember that, Dick? That was John Carco's program. Another one was the X-47A, unmanned. And because of that program that John led and did very quickly, and did charge Northrop Grumman a nickel and a dime for it, they went out and captured a program for the X-47B, an unmanned airplane that lands on aircraft carriers, a multi-billion-dollar contract. And that kind of performance is the reason that Scaled Composites thrived. When 60 Minutes calls you and say they want to do a program on you, what do you think? The first thing you think is, I'm going to get on an airliner right now and go to a country that doesn't have extradition. I ended up being featured on a double segment of 60 Minutes. And they followed me around with their TV cameras for a few months, everywhere, Oshkosh and Huntsville, Alabama, the Rocket Center, and so on. And I didn't know it at the time. Ed Bradley didn't look well, but here he is in my office. And this ended up to be his last 60 Minutes program before he died. I want to show you one of our worst days in Mojave. Our 85% scale Starship was a beautiful airplane, and there were 3 museums that wanted it. But I was ordered by Beechcraft. I guess I can say that now because they really don't exist anymore.
Just use his initials.
Okay. I was ordered to destroy it. So I hid it for a year. And then people came up with inloaders and hatchets and destroyed the airplane, so I can't show it to you in a museum right now, but it was one of the most beautiful airplanes that we ever built. Kind of made us mad. In the interim, I'm going to show you a top secret photo that I would not show to Beechcraft. It's called Grazing. Is there anybody here that works for Beechcraft? Well, no, there isn't a Beechcraft anymore. Isn't there? So I could ask that question. I got to share a thought with you, is that we considered when the first full-scale Beech Starship, by the way, I want to thank Robert Scherer, who flew right here, who flew 7 of us to Oshkosh this year in a Starship. By the way, I learned something a couple days ago, that you don't get jet lag in a Starship. You don't. You get warp lag. Let me invite Tanya to stand up. Also, my wife, Tanya. You doing something? And Brent Reagan is going to help me do the slide, the article, the talk tomorrow, midday tomorrow. And the talk describes my struggle. It describes why I failed at retirement. Here's another top secret photo that we had in a drawer and didn't show to Beechcraft. All of these pictures that you see that were taken in the 70s and 80s out of Mojave, that had airplanes in real close formation. Isn't that a nice overlap on that trail formation? Our ability to display them really properly like that is because this guy right here, the steely-eyed, velvet-armed fighter pilot, he knew how to teach someone who wasn't a fighter pilot how to safely fly formation, and how to do it properly, and how to do it like this. And when we showed up and did some cool things with formations of airplanes at Oshkosh, we wouldn't have been able to do that without Dick's expertise and training. Okay, let's look at a snapshot of the history of RAF, which is my home airplane company that did RAF, and Scale Composites. By the way, I cut this off at 2011 when I retired. I don't get a lot of information out of Mojave after that. Well, I do, but I'm not sure it's right. So I don't talk about things that were done after that. I don't give talks about Stratolaunch, the big airplane, and so on. So things that happened after I left Mojave and moved up to North Idaho and attempted to retire, I don't discuss. If you look at this blue chart here, starting with a very big and long easy Voyager, which was a RAF project, up to the point where RAF stopped selling plans in 1985. See how steep that slope was? How many? Oh, by the way, these are first flights of new airplanes and the dates at which they occurred. Look at the slope of that blue thing up there to Voyager. We flew a hell of a lot of airplanes per year. Which reminds me, you know, we had more than one new airplane just out of RAF, a company with 5 employees. And we unveiled a new airplane at Oshkosh almost every year. And at my talk this afternoon, I asked the audience, and I could see them then, where's all the new home builds? I haven't been here in 4 years. Where are the new design home builds? Where are they parked? They didn't know. Do you guys know? How in the hell can you not have new, creative, breakthrough home-built airplanes in 4 years at Rutan State in Idaho? And our little company with 5 people, we're doing 1 a year. What the hell is you guys doing? Okay, looking at the red thing, we did Starship with a small team right at first. Ares, the light attack airplane. Oh, by the way, that flat part of the RAF first flights, that's Catbird, Boomerang, and Skeagle. So, not a lot of activity going on there. Okay, Starship, Ares, Boomerang in 96, Proteus, Spaceship 1, and the last project that we did was really more like a home built, and it was done by Scaled Composites, called the Biped, the flying car. Looking at the combination of these, I'm picking out a 20-year time period, which is all of the 80s and all of the 90s. In Mojave, we had a first flight of a new type of research manned airplane at the rate of one every 8.5 months. And I have absolutely no idea. How in the hell we did that. Especially what it's taken me to do just a couple of mods to the Skeagle takes longer than that. But I think probably the answer is that there's absolutely nothing else to do in Mojave. I want to talk to you about the subject of small teams. The red shows the number of employees in the history of Rutan Aircraft Factory. By the way, I don't include Dick and Gina because I didn't pay them. Even them, along with Bruce Evans, who I did pay, I hired him for the Voyager program. But those three folk did most of the work building the Voyager. But since they're not employees, I didn't show you on here. Do you feel badly about that?
No.
Okay. Okay, let's look at the employment of Scaled Composites. It had 320 people when I retired in 2011. We had only 20 people or so average while we built and flew the Starship. And while we did a manned space program, from contract to a space flight, the total company's employees about 130. 130 people to do a manned space program? Or did I mention we were doing 4 other programs at the same time? Again, this must be a lie because I can't believe it. I'm going to give you a snapshot just to give you a feeling for small teams doing projects. I'll talk about small teams in a minute here too. In 97, Scaled had going on in active flight test. We had 3 research airplanes being built in the shop, 3 different projects, 3 different customers. We had 2 aircraft in the preliminary design phase. We had 4 proposals in the work for new projects. A total company employment of 122 people, 23 of them being indirect. They're not designing and they're not building, but they're doing things like accounting and receptionists and sweeping the floor. That makes an average of only 10 people per active program. And 2 of the airplanes that we were working on showed up at Oshkosh the next year, the Vantage and the VJ. Okay, I'm going to talk about Oshkosh in terms of it being the best place in the world to unveil a new airplane. I'm talking about first public unveiling of an airplane that the public has not seen. My companies, RAF and Scaled, and my customers have often used the EAA Oshkosh Convention as the first public unveiling. And I'm going to show you 23 slides after this one. And these are the airplanes that I was involved in that got unveiled at Oshkosh. Now, I've been to Oshkosh, it's either 34 or 40 times, something like that. I had never missed 2 in a row, but I just missed 3 in a row. But I'm back, and I'll be back next year. But I'm going to kind of flashcard this to save time, but I just want to show you 23 airplanes that were first public unveiling at Oshkosh. 1, 2, 3. That's not a very easy, that's an earlier. 4, 5. That is a very easy that the home builders built. 6, 7, 8. That's really the sweetest home built that we marketed, the Long Easy. How many people here have seen a Long Easy? How many people here have flown a Long Easy? Hey, there are a couple of beautiful ones out there in the flybys today. Isn't that neat? It was neat to me, I'll tell you. Okay, number 9. The last flight of the skew-wing NASA research airplane was in the Oshkosh Air Show. The Grizzly is sitting out here. Solitaire, there's one of these at Oshkosh today. Voyager, Catbird, which showed up last night. The Aries, Boomerang, Vantage, V-Jet. This is an absolute gorgeous airplane. It's sitting out in front of the Williams tent. Take a look at it. Proteus. This is the Atom, the White Knight, Spaceship One, Global Flyer, and the mothership for Richard Branson's program, the White Knight 2. All of the manned research aircraft types by Rutan scaled. If you total up the number of manned airplanes, you end up with 49. If you total up the ones that were preliminary designs, the latest number is 389. I hope to be able to show in a biography all of those 389 preliminary designs. But I'm going to do something that I haven't done before. I'm going to actually show you the 49 airplanes. I was not allowed to do that while I was working because, you got to get permission from the customer, and the customer has lawyers, and some of them will say no. Well, I live in North Idaho. I'm 76 years old, and I don't give a damn about lawyers.
It's all right.
This morning, I guess it was this morning's talk, I showed all of these. Okay, just to close, show you some things that I'm really proud of. That's a good place to hang a used airplane, is in the milestones of flight. I had trouble talking Paul Allen into flying the X Prize flights because if we made a smoking hole with it, it couldn't hang there now. These are my 2 Collier trophies and my 2 Doolittle trophies, SETP's management and engineering trophies. I'm the only one alive that has 2 Colliers that are awarded by individual accomplishment. The others were Kelly Johnson and Glenn Curtis. So this is. You mind if I take a little time? We can do over. I want to tell a little story about this. See the Collier replicas that I have on my mantle here?
Want me to give your voice a rest for a minute?
I'm almost done. Got one more slide. My replica of the Collier trophy for Voyager is plaster and it's painted gold. And the reason is, when you win a Collier, NAA doesn't have money and they say, you buy the trophy. And Voyager didn't have any money. Later, for Spaceship One, when they said to Paul Allen, who was worth, by that time, I don't know, 20 billion or something, he had the money. And my other replica is Oh, what happened to it? There it is. My other replica is in wood and bronze, just like the big one. Okay, hand off to Brother Dick.
Wow. Living with an inventive genius. You know, actually, a lot of people don't know this, but the inspiration to what Burt has accomplished, I take credit for that. Because my counsel to him, when every time he comes up and says, we are going to build an airplane and it's going to fly twice the distance that any airplane has ever flown before, and it's going to fly around the world non-stop, non-refueled. Oh? Or especially when he comes up and he says, hey, we're going to make spacecraft. I says, hey, Burt, you know, you've done a lot of neat things, but you know, we build home-built airplanes out of Mojave. There is no fine way that you're going to make an astronaut. But the funny thing is that every time proves me wrong. Now, it's a very special person, Burt, and he told me a couple of things that stayed in my memory for a long time, that made a lot of sense. And one of the most significant things that he said was, and it's kind of a prominent theme in my new book that's just coming out. He said something very profound, and it says, never forget this. He says, be very careful how you use the word impossible. Right? You know, when Burt came up and said that they were going to do a spaceship to make astronauts, you know, that wasn't anybody within 10,000 miles that thought they could actually do that. But it's the courage to try. Now, I noticed a couple of things that Burt didn't show here. You know, all of these were not successful. And we'll argue about it. Maybe a third of them were not successful. But that's probably about the perfect ratio that somebody that has that inventive genius that Burt has to fail. Arthur C. Clarke said, one of his laws, he says, the only way to determine one's limitation is occasionally you must break it. And if somebody goes along and they've never had a failure, that means that they haven't pressed themselves hard enough. And Burt tries things and ideas, and some of them don't work. And like our mother always told us, he says, hey guys, you will learn more through failure than you do success. And that's the truth too. You know, success kind of changes some things. One is the Voyager flight around the world. Now, we were successful on the first attempt, which is a bloody miracle to me, because the most amazing person when we landed at Edwards and just before Christmas in 1986, I thought there was nobody there, and all the people that came out to greet us, there was nobody more amazed to be there than yours truly. But one thing happened after that, after we landed. The development for longer range airplanes stopped right there because we were successful. I often thought about what if we landed 100 miles short and ran out of gas? The development for long range airplanes would have continued. And maybe I'll look back and what I'm thinking about what Burt said is, look what happened to the Apollo program. It was a success. And everybody gave up. I got to point out a couple other things too about the programs. Voyager was a poverty program. Now, I listened to some of these other programs Burt talks about, and there's a word associated with each one of those things, and it starts with a B. It's called a billionaire. A man comes up with a lot of money, and he funds it. And that's really required for somebody that's successful, that they can do it a lot quicker. We started out with Voyager with not 2 nickels to rub together. And we messed around and talked to a lot of people. American Express, all the big advertisers. We did turn down a couple of $1 million. $2.2 million we turned down. I can't tell you how poor we were back then. But I told them that your whole industry doesn't have enough money for us to put a cigarette on the side of that airplane. I said, how in the world can I even sleep at night trying to perpetuate the most deadly narcotic ever perpetrated on mankind? No way. You know, we did talk to a lot of people, and some of the big corporations were really interested. They said, hey, you know, we'd like to do that. A lot of exposure for our product all the way around the world. A lot of people going to see it. But then there's a guy, I found out he was a corporate lawyer. He'd walk up and whisper in the boss's ear, and he'd say, hey, boss, I hate to tell you this, but this is a pretty risky program. He says, try to vision your logo or our logo on national television at the end of a runway in a fireball. They said, why don't you come back and see us when you're done? Baron Hilton almost did fund it, I think. And he told us later that he wished that he had done that. The only other one that I met, the guy's name was Ross Perot. Ross Perot Jr. Ever heard of him?
Yeah. Just died.
Of all the people that I've ever met or had association with for funding or anything like that, Ross Perot was my favorite. He was a very courteous gentleman, and one thing was that he was dead nuts honest about what he did. If you go and ask somebody to do something, hey, would you fund our project? They say, well, I'd like to, but hey, I know Jake. Boy, he'd love to fund it. Oh, Woody. And so we run over and talk to Jake, and Jake has somebody else. And it took us a while to figure out what they were doing to us. Ross Perot Jr. has some technical questions, and we couldn't answer it. And when we came back to Mojave, I asked Burt, wrote up the technical question, and sent it back to Ross Perot. And he said no. And he didn't jack us around with anything. If it's no, then say no. You don't have to make an excuse. Although he did offer an excuse that I thought was kind of interesting. He says, I can't do that because I'm the chairman of the school board, and you and Gina are not married. Now in California, I guess that wasn't a big thing, but evidently in the Bible Belt it was significant. But it was a real honor and a privilege to meet him. Another thing that billionaires do, and this always stuck in my craw, is that a big billionaire comes to Burt and say, hey, build me an airplane to fly around the world non-stop, non-refueled. And Burt says, well, I already did a propeller one. I'll do a jet one this time. And he did. And he built this single-engine jet. It was an incredible airplane. It had some incredible specifics, and fuel fractions. And it did go around the world and break our record. But back then, he had GPS, and he got credit for every single inch that he flew. In the Voyager, I was only identified 5 times around the world, and we had a straight line distance between the two. In actual reality, the Voyager flew almost 2,000 miles farther than that did. They got credit for it, GPS. But the thing that really honked me off a little bit about multi-billionaires and their publicity thing is that they advertised that flight. He said, this is the first person to ever fly around the world non-stop, non-refueled. I said, hey, you know, I don't have $1 billion program for publicity, but there was other, 20 years ago they did that. And I complained about that, and they says, no, you didn't listen, Rutan. He said the first person to fly around the world nonstop. Person, singular, because he did it solo. Took them 3 days instead of 9. It's pretty good. Only thing, he was second. Yeah, I always try to put things in a historical perspective. If you think about what Lindbergh had to work with for navigation and whatever the technology of 1927 would offer him was, that age and that era. Now, he flew around the world in May of 1927. Now, put 20 years on that. If you put 20 years on that, you could go to New York City and you could buy a ticket as a passenger and you could have hot meals and you could have a sleeping berth to go New York to Paris. Historical perspective again. The Voyager program was, it was really interesting. I think if it had been fully funded, maybe we wouldn't have done it, but we wouldn't have been able to do it. But the old adage goes, if you don't have enough money to pay somebody to mow your lawn, you get to mow it yourself. And so after we went around and talked to all the billionaires and all the big corporations and stuff, and finally figured out, we're at El Monte Airport Association, and there was a handful of people just exactly like you that's sitting in this audience right now. There's only 12 of you there. And Gene and I would go around and we would try to sell our posters to buy gas so we could go to different venues and stuff. And somebody come up and they were buying our $10 posters. And then I give Jane a credit for this, and she says, you know something? You know who's going to fund this thing? And it's not any bloody billionaire. It's going to be y'all. The people. And so she came up with this little thing, and it was called the VIP Club, the Voyagers Impressive People Club. And probably somebody out here is probably a member of that club, and God bless you, and thank you for the support, because it made it. If you look in the museum, and look at our little kiosk there, you'll notice that there's $2 bills. And there's a little note under it, and it says, don't laugh, I did not have lunch today. And that was such an inspiration to us that we put that on the wall to inspire us over the 5.5 years it was going to take to do this program. I got really good at doing things on my knees, begging. In the VIP club, they paid, the only thing I could offer them was a private newsletter and $100. $100, and for that you could be a member of our VIP club, and then we'll carry your name around the world and give you a confidential newsletter. That was it. And what we made from the VIP club would sustain us personally. It could pay the electric bill and the rents and all the miscellaneous stuff. But the big buck items are something that I had to go and beg for. The magic door. It seems like whatever it was, the magic door would open, and what we needed would walk through. A couple of examples. I've heard about this liquid-cooled engine. It was a classified thing for some military classified drone, high altitude. Excellent fuel specific, and the phone rang one day, and it was Don Bigler, and he was the CEO of Teledyne Continental Motors, and he called and he said, hey, I got a really neat engine. I think maybe it'd be perfect for your airplane. I said, wow, would it ever? He says, yeah, I think that I'll donate it to you. Wow, was that neat? That means we could leave a couple of 1,000 pounds of fuel home we didn't need. I was sitting at my desk one day and had the Rolodex open to a guy's name was Ed King. You ever heard of Ed King? King Radio? You bet. He makes excellent equipment. I think he got bought out or something, but Ed King's not here. But in those days, he made the very finest equipment. The Voyager was a poverty program, but we didn't get our stuff at the junkyard. We had to have the very finest that the industry had to offer. I was sitting at my telephone. I had my hand on the telephone, and I had the Rolodex open, and I was putting in my mind what I was going to say to Ed King for him to donate $250,000 worth of avionics that we needed for the flight. And the phone rang, and I picked it up. And he says, I'm Ed King. I make some pretty good equipment, and I'd be honored if he would use my product to fly around the world. Another example of courage and the ability to stay at it and don't take no for an answer first. And this guy's name was Bob Jones. Bob Jones, gotta love him. Now, Bob Jones was a salesman for Hercules carbon fiber at that time. And carbon fiber at that time, I think, was almost $50 a linear yard. Expensive. Super neat stuff, but expensive. And Burt says that he needed, with carbon fiber, that he could build and design an airplane capable of going around the world. And he was right. Yes, he was right. Good word. Anyway, Bob Jones realized about carbon fiber in the new industry, and he's a great salesman. And he goes to the boss, and he walks in and he says, "Hey, you guys need to fund this thing. This is a really neat thing." And the boss throws him out of the office. And he says, he's standing, he thought, well, it's really important. I'm going to try again. So he goes back in the office and he gets thrown in. He gets thrown out 3 or 4 times. And finally, the boss of Hercules up in Salt Lake City he says, "Damn it, Walt, I'm tired of throwing you out of my office." He says, "Okay, I'll fund it." Now, while Walt Jones was being thrown out of the Hercules office, we started building Voyager. And we started building Voyager with Bob Jones' salesman samples. Isn't that cool? But the magic door, it seemed to open up, and whatever we needed kind of walked through. I got this book that was written, and I'd kind of like to tell the story about what happened in the Voyager and some of my military days and some other kind of a semi-autobiography of Dick. And I'll tell you, once it was taken out of the book, they wouldn't let me print it. But you're all special, right? You won't ever tell anybody? Now, after the Voyager flight, we were honored with a lot of things. The Collier Trophy, that was a pretty big deal. We got the Citizens Medal from President Reagan, and a lot of awards that went along with that. And one of the very special awards was some of the European ones. Now the French, they know how to give aviators great reception, right? Remember Lindbergh and so forth. And what they thought so much of this flight, they were going to give us the Aero Club the gold medal of France for that year, 1986. And so what they wanted to make it really special, so what they did, they went into exactly the same room that the presentation was made from Lindbergh. And they had the same people there, except the people that now hold that particular office or government thing. And they said almost the same words, and they made us stand in the same thing. And they wanted to recreate the Lindbergh ceremony identical for the Voyager. You know, what an incredible honor I thought that was. Couldn't understand what was going on, but that was really a great honor. Now, the next one, hey, don't tell anybody about this, okay? And it may upset some of you, but it's all in good faith, right? Some of you are going to be upset. Now, the Royal British Aero Club is going to present their gold medal to the crew of the Voyager in a special ceremony. So what can they do in royalty, right? Royalty. They decided that the presentation was going to be made by Prince Charles, the Duke of Wales. Heard of him? And his father. His father was Prince Philip, and he was the Duke of something. I forgot what it was. Anyway, but one thing is, you've got to admire these people. They're both pilots. His dad is a pilot, and and Prince Charles, royalty, line from the King of England. He's a fighter pilot. He flew F-4s and so forth, so he's a fellow fighter pilot. So anyway, we're going to be briefed about how to handle and conduct ourselves and comport ourselves in the presence of royalty, right? So anyway, they have a special protocol lady, And you've never seen anybody so nervous in your whole life. She was just nervous as heck. And she was going to brief us on exactly the protocol that we had to use to be, to receive this thing from the royal family of Britain. Very special. She was very nervous. And I asked her, I said, since our flight was only made possible because of an invention by Britain. Britain they discovered and invented carbon fiber. It's I forgot the name of it. Polyacrylic nitrate fibers burnt in a oxygen-free furnace. Anyway, it lines all the molecules up, and they invented that. And this is an incredible material, as we all know. And I thought, generally when you receive a gift, you say, hey, I want to thank you for this. You were part of the program, and be appreciative. And I asked her, I said, is it okay if I say something about the fact that it's British material? And she just about had a heart attack. So, oh God, no, don't say anything. You must do this and stand in whatever the protocol is. And I'm an American fighter pilot, right? Now, I'm not going to go and mess up their performance, and I'm going to follow all the rules, even though I have to bite my tongue. But I thought, there's somebody here that can override this rule, right? They can give a special dispensation to accept, the gratitude of what they've invented. And so I'm standing there, and it's a big long hall, and it's all with the royal accoutrements all over and the things and whatever. And it's kind of a long hall. At this end, there's a purple rope. Purple rope goes along. And us commoners, we would stand behind the purple rope. Now there's about 20 or 30 feet of open space, and there was a little stage up there. And pretty soon Prince Charles and the Duke of Edinburgh came in, his father. And boy, they were royal. They had the big royal stuff on and their big thing. And they're standing down there, how royalty looks down upon us commoners. And I looked at my watch, and it was about 10 minutes before the formal ceremony to start. And I realized there is somebody that just came into the room who can change that protocol. He's standing up there on that stage. And so this American, from a free country, right? He had the audacity to step across the purple rope and walk directly up to the royals. And I walked up about this far from his face, and I says, "Hey, Chuck." And I described to him, it's really good that you guys invented it, and I'd like to say a word of thanks and during the presentation, if that's okay. Ha! Well, I found out in no uncertain terms that it was not okay. And he said one word that was so emphatic, no, it could only come from royalty. And so I just shrugged my shoulders, turned my back upon him, and proceed back to join my commoners across the purple rope. And they made me take that out of my book. Now, it was a grand adventure. Growing up with Burt. Burt and I, they'd say that we did fight a lot during the Voyager project. When I told him I was going to take radar along, he almost going to kill me, and we had big controversies about this and that, and different things about weight saving. And he wanted to save weight on any way he could. He wouldn't even give us any radios or anything to operate. But Burt is the inventive genius. He designed that airplane out of carbon fiber, and it had horrible flying qualities, but it had to have horrible flying qualities to achieve 29,000 statute mile range. Think about that a minute. And that was the compromise we had to make. As an example, how he hit this thing nuts. The rudder's supposed to keep the airplane pointing in this way. And the test pilots, you yaw the airplane and see if it's going to straighten out. You yaw an airplane, And generally, there's three things that can happen, and two of them are really bad. But he yawed the airplane, and it hung there for a little while, and almost imperceptibly, it came back to unyawed flight. He nailed it perfectly. And those are the compromises he did to make that thing possible. Even though the two brothers fought a lot about that. But if you take both Burt and you take Dick, who's the guy that knew what he was facing out over the Pacific Ocean, and Burt was trying to design an airplane to give you the range that would actually work. If you take both of those two brothers and you pour them in a bucket and you stir them up, and what gets poured out was exactly what was required in 1986 to fly the longest flight ever. Non-stop, non-refuel flight around the world. Now, you promised me you won't tell about that story.
Are we ready for questions and answers, or do?
We're the Rutan brothers. We're ready for it.
Is that right? You know, it would help a lot if the brightness of our lights would allow us to. Oh, there we go. I can see.
Take out the audience.
Oh,
and
there
take
is
down the
somebody
front
there.
light.
Do you want us to bring our chairs up front, or do you?
If you wish, or
Right.
if you're to
I
stay
feel
on
like
some more.
I'm being.
By the way, the
stand
buses
up.
run till 11:15, so you don't have to panic, okay? Raise your hand, we'll come to you.
You want to ask John?
I don't even need to walk. Senator Friend.
Question for Dick. I recall that Charles Lindbergh had remarked that there was an instability in the spirit of St. Louis, and you described an instability in Voyager. And Lindbergh said that instability in the spirit of St. Louis, I believe it was a pitch instability, kept him awake during critical parts of his flight across the Atlantic. Did you experience that similar type of thing where that convolved with the human factors to help conclude that flight successfully?
Yes, and it's an excellent question, and I want to talk just a second about human factors. Now, if you're in a long duration flight, fatigue is a big issue. Now, if you're working really hard on something, then you become fatigued, right? But there's another fatigue that's even more devastating, and that is sensory deprivation. When you're sitting here with nothing going on, then the fatigue is overwhelming. And Burt made this airplane with the instability that we had to make this range, that the workload on the Voyager was absolutely perfect to keep it stable. The anxiety if the autopilot clicks off, maybe it'll start hopping up and down like that. And then the thing that keeps you busy, kind of fun, and that is that he told me, he says, nautical mile per pound of fuel. Nautical mile per pound of fuel. Or nautical inch per gram of fuel. And so there's one speed to fly versus its gross weight to achieve that. And then the other factor is, first of all, you got to fly that speed. Second of all, you got to tune those darn 1938 antique engines to get the very finest fuel specific. And you can sit there and tweak and tweak and tweak. And real quick, I was halfway around the world, and I don't know where we're out in some God lost your shoes ocean. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I'm watching the fuel flow. I'll never forget it. And the fuel flow was 4.2 gallons an hour, 4.2 gallons an hour. And I kept thinking about worrying about this nightmare that we're not going to make it around the world because of fuel. And this reoccurring nightmare. The reoccurring nightmare was that I flew around the world and I landed 100 miles short in a dry lake someplace. One hell of a flight, but we did not technically accomplish our mission. And I never had another chance to repeat it or fix it. And I had to live with that the rest of my life. And I looked in my mirror and I had to shave a guy that got tired and sloppy and knowing in his own heart that he could have done it if he didn't get sloppy. And that nightmare recurred to me, and I looked at that thing, and right off my hand like it was going to crack a safe, and it says, I'm going to get this thing on that speed, and I'm going to roll it back to 4.1 gallons an hour. And I sat there for about the next 50 minutes, and I tweaked and tweaked and tweaked and tweaked and tweaked, and bingo, I got 4.1 gallons an hour for that airspeed. And then I thought, if we don't make it back, there is no way that Dick is ever going to look in the mirror and say, damn it, Dick, you were sloppy and you could have done it better. And I didn't want to ever live with that.
That's the velvet left arm.
Other questions?
Yeah, we put it in a bag and dumped it overboard, so. We didn't want the it to hit the fan, to push it.
Okay, I've got a question for here. You on your right.
Burt, Dick, there's something you don't know. For the every year that you and Mom and Pop came to Oshkosh, in between tent talks, Mom and I would converse, and she'd sit in that old, I think it was a station wagon, okay? So I spent more time with your mother at Oshkosh than probably you did, all right? The other thing is that you remember the exploded view of the Long Easy and the winglet that you sold? You remember that? And you signed it, and you and your wife at the time, Burt, had signed it, and Sally and Dick, you signed it also. Well, your mom, okay, we were out at one of these sittings, and I asked her if she would sign it, because I wanted your dad and your dad on one wing and your mom on the other. And she looked up at me and she said, "Did you know I was a wing walker?" And I never looked at her in the eye and doubted a second, okay? But I wanted to share that story with you, and bless it.
Okay, I need to go ahead.
My name is Frank.
Oh.
Yeah, Frank Dress.
Yeah, Frank, I need to formally request a correction. It's actually a zoomed cutaway view, because us rocket people don't use the word exploded.
To your right.
Good evening. Over here to your right. I wanted to ask about your parents. Is that where you, as brothers, got your inspiration from? Was it Mom, Dad, or was it just you two fed off of each other?
Now, Mom was an incredible inspiration to both of us. And like Burt talked about, is that we had the most incredible parents, because not one time did they ever say you couldn't do something. And Dad would tell me, he says, I remember you on the farm in Oregon, even in your diapers, you were all out exploring someplace. And he says he thought there's going to be an explorer. But Mom's inspiration, I'll give you a couple of Momisms. If you can dream it, you can do it, and the only way to fail is if you quit. Don't worry about anything you can do nothing about.
I really do. If we had been born a year or two apart, we're actually more than 5 years.
Well, we were never in the same school together.
Yeah, that's right. We were 5 years difference. Dick is, I won't tell you how old he is, but I'm 76.
That doesn't matter.
The fact that it was 5 years, I don't remember us ever being truly competitive with each other. There's no way I could compete with my brother. I could sneak out and ride his motorcycle without him knowing. But I really couldn't compete with him, you know. And he started off in the Air Force as a navigator. And before anybody noticed, though, he was a fighter pilot. But he did have a very minor role in teaching me to fly while I was going out trying to work towards my private license. He showed up in an Air Force T-34